Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but hushed with rituals, pauses, and the weight of silence. Here, history does not shout. It drifts like incense, rising slowly, lingering in the air, fading only to return in whispers. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these forgotten moments can drift further, perhaps reaching others who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, share your location and the exact time you're watching. It's always fascinating to imagine those scattered points of light across the world, each of you listening quietly, together, though apart. There are certain punishments in history that do not simply belong to the body, but to the imagination. They survive not only in the suffering of those who endured them, but in the quiet fear that rippled outward from the chambers where judgment was spoken. In ancient China, justice was not always measured in speed or severity. It was measured in the weight of silence, in the echo of footsteps on polished stone, in the careful way an official adjusted his robes before delivering a sentence. It was here, in these vast courts lit by oil lamps and shadowed by heavy draperies, that whispers took root, whispers of a punishment so drawn out, so precise, that its cruelty seemed almost ritual. The court was not a place of sudden noise. It was a place of controlled breath, of pauses that carried more meaning than speeches. When the emperor's magistrates gathered, their heads bowed in long rows, they did not rush toward decisions. The law in those centuries was not a blunt tool. It was an art sharpened by centuries of dynasties rising and falling. Within these halls, where calligraphy scrolled across screens of lacquered wood and incense burned with slow insistence, the idea of punishment was tied to the larger order of the cosmos. To rule was to balance heaven and earth, and when imbalance arose, when a crime against the empire or the emperor himself was committed, it demanded not only correction, but demonstration. The whisper began, as many things did, not with official proclamations, but with stories. Courtiers spoke softly to one another, fearful that the walls themselves might carry their words. They spoke of a punishment that unmade a man without killing him outright, that stretched death into an experience so slow that it became a spectacle, a warning, and a lesson all at once. The term was Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. It was not yet a common phrase, but in these early murmurings, it carried the dread of something both real and unimaginable. The laws of China were detailed, vast, and layered with centuries of commentary. Each dynasty inherited the codes of its predecessors and reshaped them to fit its own vision of control. In the Song and Yuan dynasties, and later under the Ming and Qing, justice reached levels of intricacy that reflected the precision of the imperial state. Punishment was not only for the criminal, it was for the public eye, for the preservation of order, for the confirmation that the emperor stood as the axis of a moral universe. The whisper of Lingchi drifted among these laws as both warning and tool. Imagine a hall where sunlight filters faintly through carved lattice windows, dust motes moving in the air as if time itself were slowed. The accused kneels on the cold floor, wrists bound, head bowed. He does not speak, because to speak is to disturb the heavy quiet. Around him, officials sit with bamboo slips and scrolls, recording, debating, noting precedents. A crime has been judged to be of the gravest kind: treason, blasphemy against the emperor, or a betrayal so deep that exile or simple execution is deemed too light. For such transgressions, the sentence must carry a different weight, one that does not end with a single stroke of the blade. The whisper becomes a sentence. The sentence becomes a ritual. And once spoken, it binds not only the condemned, but the crowd who will one day gather to witness. In those courts, justice was layered with ceremony. Before a punishment was enacted, there was an almost theatrical unfolding of process. Papers passed from hand to hand, red seals pressed into wax, the emperor's authority moving through invisible channels until it reached the man whose fate was already sealed. Even the announcement of death by 1,000 cuts carried a rhythm, spoken with the calm clarity of men who believed themselves to be instruments of cosmic order. The condemned was rarely surprised. By the time the sentence reached him, he had already passed through a labyrinth of accusations, interrogations, and confessions, some given willingly, others forced under the methods of the age. Yet it was one thing to expect death, and another to hear that death would not come swiftly. The body stiffens, though the face may remain composed. Those who received this sentence knew that their names would not fade quietly. They would become examples, stories told in tea houses, warnings written into the margins of legal codes, remembered not for who they were, but for how they were undone. And so the whisper travelled outward, slipping from the courts into the streets of the city. Merchants spoke of it as they closed their stalls. Scholars mentioned it in hushed tones over candlelight. Even children, half understanding, repeated fragments of what they had overheard, turning it into rumour and shadow. To live in the presence of such a punishment was to live with the knowledge that the state could reach beyond the body's endurance, beyond the boundary of a single moment, and hold suffering in its grasp as long as it wished. But whispers alone were not enough. For the court, for the emperor, for the logic of imperial rule, the act itself had to be staged. Execution in China was not hidden away. It was not something to be done in private chambers, away from the eyes of the people. It was, instead, a performance of power. The dark courts may have been where the sentence was spoken, but the open squares were where its meaning was fulfilled. And in the quiet preparation for that day, in the way officials selected the executioners, marked the calendar, and spread word to the city, the whisper became a certainty. History remembers empires in terms of conquests, trade, inventions, and monuments. Yet within those same centuries, there is another history, a quieter one, where power was not only about building, but about controlling through fear. Death by 1,000 cuts was never the punishment of the ordinary criminal. It was the punishment of those whose actions had shaken the foundation of order itself. To whisper of it was to remind all who listened that the emperor's reach extended not only into life, but into the very manner of one's death. In these dark courts, the weight of silence carried more power than shouts ever could. The whisper of Lingchi was not only about what would happen to the condemned, it was about what might happen to anyone. The courtiers knew this, the magistrates knew this, the people beyond the palace gates knew this. The punishment lingered in thought long before it was ever carried out, and that, perhaps, was its most terrifying power. For in ancient China, to whisper was often enough. It was a small sound, easily lost. Yet when it carried the weight of imperial law, that whisper was louder than any cry. The whisper that curled through the dark courts of the empire did not float freely. It was tethered, always, to something heavier, the law itself. For in China, law was not a fragile collection of rules, but a living spine of the dynasty, a framework that held the world together. Each character, inked on bamboo slips or paper scrolls, was more than instruction. It was the emperor's shadow cast across the land. To break the law was not merely to disrupt the lives of men. It was to tilt the balance between heaven and earth, to disturb the order that made rivers flow, crops grow, and the empire endure. Those who gathered in the courts understood this weight. They sat in neat rows, robes arranged like folds of a vast tapestry, Their silence not only respect, but recognition that they carried something larger than themselves. Behind every judgment was the will of the emperor, and behind that will was the mandate of heaven. When the law demanded punishment, it was never the voice of a single man, nor even of a dynasty. It was the order of the cosmos speaking through the emperor's hand. The codes that governed justice were vast, like an ocean with depths few dared to measure. Crimes were listed with precision, their punishments carefully recorded. Theft, assault, bribery, each carried consequences designed not merely to balance scales, but to show that no action slipped beyond notice. Yet some crimes were not written with ordinary ink. They stood apart, set down in darker strokes, their gravity immense. To betray the emperor, to conspire against the state, to mock the harmony of heaven's chosen order, these were not simple failings of men. These were wounds inflicted upon the empire itself. For such crimes, the law had no interest in swiftness. Death by a single strike of the blade might end a life, but it did not show the fullness of consequence. The weight of law demanded something longer, something that unfolded slowly, so that those who watched would carry the memory like a mark etched deep into bone. This was where the emperor's will bent toward Lingchi, the punishment of 1,000 cuts. Imagine an imperial decree unfurling across the polished table of a magistrate. The red seal pressed into the paper glows faintly in the lamplight. It is not only ink and wax, it is the emperor's presence itself. The magistrate bows low before it, for he understands that to hold such a document is to hold heaven's command. Within the neat characters lies a fate, not merely death, but a demonstration. The law has spoken, and the emperor has affirmed it. There will be no mercy. And yet within this severity, there was order. The law was not chaos unleashed, it was carefully measured cruelty, justified by the needs of empire. The emperor's will was not whimsical. It did not move like the wind, quick and changeable. It moved with deliberation, like the slow turning of a great river. To sentence a man to 1,000 cuts was to align earthly justice with the rhythm of the heavens, to show that rebellion or betrayal had no place in the structure of the world. The condemned man knew this. Bound in silence, he was more than a criminal. He was an example. His body would become the parchment upon which the empire wrote its warning. His suffering would be a text more powerful than any scroll, read not by scholars but by crowds, remembered long after words faded. The law did not end with his execution. It lived on in the minds of those who saw it, in the fear that crept through their households, in the whispered stories told beneath low roofs as families gathered at night. The emperor himself, distant in his palace, rarely saw these executions. He did not need to. His will was not in the spectacle, but in the certainty that it would be carried out. The magistrates and executioners were his instruments, their movements extensions of his command. When the law demanded Lingchi, it was as though the emperor's eyes had turned upon one man and declared him unworthy of swift release. The body must linger, and through its lingering, order must be reaffirmed. The streets outside the courts carried the echo of this weight. Merchants knew that cheating the tax collector was not merely a game of survival, but a gamble with forces far greater. Farmers understood that neglecting tribute was not simply disobedience, but a disruption of cosmic balance. Even those far from the capital, who had never seen the emperor's face, lived under the pressure of his will, transmitted through laws that seemed as unyielding as the mountains themselves. There is a kind of silence that falls when power is absolute. It is not the silence of peace, but of awareness. The sense that every word, every act is watched by eyes that cannot be deceived. In ancient China, this silence pressed upon the people like the weight of stone. To live within the emperor's law was to move carefully, to bow often, to remember always that one's place in the world was not chosen freely, but bestowed from above. And yet, within this silence, the law had its own strange comfort. It was harsh, yes, but it was also certain. To live beneath its shadow was to know the boundaries of survival. So long as one did not betray the emperor, so long as one remained within the lines carved by authority, life could continue with its rituals, planting, harvesting, trading, worshipping. The law was heavy, but it was predictable. What lay beyond its limits, however, was terrifying. And it was here, in the space beyond those limits, that Lingchi awaited. The emperor's will gave the punishment its shape, but the law gave it its permanence. One ruler might die, another might rise, dynasties might crumble and be rebuilt, yet the codes endured. They were recopied, reinterpreted, adjusted to suit new reigns, but always with the same intent: to bind men not only to rulers, but to the very concept of order itself. In this way, Lingchi was not simply the choice of a single emperor, but the reflection of centuries of legal thought sharpened into cruelty. Picture the parchment of law stretched across the centuries. On it are written not only crimes and punishments, but the heartbeat of an empire. Each decree, each amendment, each careful phrase carries the imprint of a ruler's mind and the fear of those who would disobey. To stand before such a document was to feel not only the authority of the present emperor, but the weight of all who had come before. The condemned man, kneeling before judgment, bowed not only to one ruler, but to 1,000 years of accumulated will. And so the whisper of punishment grew heavier. It was no longer rumour, no longer a shadow in the court. It was law. It was decree. It was the emperor's voice carried down corridors, through towns, across provinces. By the time the condemned was led away, the people knew what awaited him, not because they had seen it before, but because the weight of law had made it certain the body would be undone, and through that undoing, the empire would stand more firmly than before. The courts returned to silence. Officials adjusted their robes, ink dried upon scrolls, and candles burned low. Yet the decision lingered, heavier than the stone pillars that held the roof above. For once, the emperor's will had spoken through the law. There was no turning back. The condemned had become a vessel of meaning, and through his suffering, the empire would remind itself of its own order. Thus the weight of law pressed upon all, invisible yet undeniable. It was in the rustle of silk robes, in the crackle of sealing wax, in the careful brushstrokes of characters upon parchment. It was in the bowed heads of courtiers, in the hushed voices of the people, in the quiet knowledge that the emperor's will was as immovable as the stars above. And within this weight, the punishment of 1,000 cuts waited, patient, inevitable, and absolute. In the dim corridors of the empire, where the law pressed down like stone, and the emperor's will stretched far beyond the palace walls, the very notion of crime carried a different weight. To transgress was not merely to wound a neighbour or to cheat a merchant. It was to disturb the delicate balance of a society that saw itself as an extension of heaven's order. A single act of betrayal could ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water, unsettling the quiet fabric of villages, towns and cities. It was from these ripples that shadows gathered, the shadows of crime, and with them, the birth of fear. Crimes in ancient China did not arise in a vacuum. They grew out of hunger, ambition, desperation, or the endless lure of power. A farmer, pressed by famine, might steal grain meant for tribute. A soldier, disillusioned by years of service, might whisper sedition to his comrades. A courtier, eager for favour, might conspire in silence against a rival. Each act, however small it seemed, risked unravelling the larger tapestry. For in the eyes of the state, crime was not only personal, it was contagious, a spark that could ignite rebellion, a seed that could grow into chaos. And so the empire watched carefully, its officials moving like shadows themselves, recording, reporting, ensuring that no act of defiance went unseen. The threat of punishment, especially one as feared as Lingchi, hung invisibly over the people, like a weight pressing down from the heavens. It was not always the act itself that inspired dread, but the knowledge of what might follow. To hear of a man sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts was enough to silence conversations, to lower voices in the marketplace, to make children cling tighter to their mothers as dusk fell. The fear was not only of suffering, but of exposure. In a world bound by duty to family and clan, the crime of one man often drew punishment upon his kin. To betray the emperor was to endanger not only oneself, but generations of bloodline. Entire households could be dragged into disgrace, their names erased, their property seized, their ancestors dishonoured. This collective consequence deepened the fear, for it meant that a single moment of weakness could echo across lifetimes. Whispers of crime, once spoken, took on a life of their own. A neighbour's suspicion, a servant's murmur, a passing glance at a forbidden text, all could be enough to set a chain of investigation in motion. Shadows lengthened in the minds of the people, where guilt and fear blurred together. Men and women grew skilled at silence, at the careful folding of words into nothingness. Better to say little than to risk saying too much. In such an atmosphere, even the innocent felt the weight of dread, for innocence alone was no shield, when accusation carried more force than defence. The courts became theatres where these shadows were given shape. Accused men knelt, trembling, as officials recited charges written in measured calligraphy. Each word, each phrase, was delivered with the slow rhythm of inevitability. The audience of clerks and magistrates watched with faces that betrayed nothing, but within them lay the certainty that the law's demands were never accidental. If a man had been brought here, then already the shadows had grown too dark to ignore. His fate was no longer his own. It was in this climate that the fear of Lingchi rooted itself most deeply. The punishment was not common, it was reserved for crimes that threatened the very heart of the empire. But its rarity did not lessen its power. On the contrary, the scarcity of its use made the whispers more potent. To know that somewhere, in some distant square, a man was being unmade by the executioner's blade was to know that the empire could, at any moment, reach beyond ordinary justice and summon terror into being. Consider the weight of a single accusation of treason. A word spoken in anger, a document misplaced, a conversation overheard, all could draw suspicion. And once suspicion arose, it was like a shadow that never left, clinging to a man's name, following him through the streets, darkening every interaction. Families feared not only the crime itself, but the appearance of crime, for appearances could be enough. Fear thus became a constant companion, teaching the people to lower their heads, to avoid unnecessary words, to accept their place in the order of things. This culture of silence and dread was no accident. The law intended it so. Fear was a tool, as sharp and effective as any sword. It guided behaviour more powerfully than soldiers, more quietly than decrees. It entered the home, the market, the temple. It bent men toward obedience before they even considered disobedience. And at the centre of this carefully cultivated fear was the memory of Lingchi, the whispered punishment that ensured no man could mistake the boundaries of loyalty. Even the spaces of daily life carried the imprint of this fear. At night, when lanterns flickered and shadows stretched long across the wooden walls of homes, families spoke softly of loyalty, of the need to remain upright and obedient. Children listened wide-eyed as elders told stories of men who had betrayed the emperor and paid the price in flesh. These stories, carried from one generation to the next, were not told with anger or outrage. They were told with quiet solemnity, as if they were as natural as the rising of the moon. In villages far from the capital, where the emperor's face was only an image painted on scrolls, his presence was still felt through this atmosphere of fear. Farmers who had never seen a court still knew of its judgments. Merchants who had never stood before a magistrate still felt the shadow of the law. Fear did not require proximity. It required only memory, the kind that lived in whispers and stories. And so crime, whether real or imagined, was never simply an act. It was a seed that, once planted, could grow into consequences beyond imagining. The punishment of 1,000 cuts was the empire's way of showing that no seed would go unanswered, that the smallest betrayal could flower into the most terrible of ends. Fear was born not in the execution itself, but in the possibility of it, in the knowledge that beneath the silence of the night, the empire was always listening. The shadows of crime lingered long after the accused were gone. Their names, spoken only cautiously, became reminders of what it meant to cross the boundaries of law. The stories of their undoing moved from mouth to mouth, reshaped and magnified, until they became more than history. They became warnings etched into memory. Each retelling added weight to the fear, ensuring that the empire's hold extended not only over bodies, but over minds. Thus fear became a constant companion of life. It sat beside men as they ate, followed women as they walked to the market, settled itself into the hearts of children as they drifted to sleep. The empire did not need to remind its people daily of Lingchi. The shadows of crime and the stories they inspired did that work endlessly, carrying the weight of law into every corner of existence. In the end, crime was never only about guilt or innocence. It was about the empire's ability to define reality itself. A man could be guilty in the eyes of the law even if he believed himself innocent. He could be innocent in his own conscience, yet condemned by the suspicion of others. The shadows blurred the line until it no longer mattered. What mattered was the fear, the quiet, persistent reminder that in a world governed by the emperor's will, safety was fragile, and loyalty was the only shield against a punishment too terrifying to name aloud. When judgment was spoken, and the seal of the emperor pressed its weight upon parchment, the life of the condemned no longer belonged to himself. From that moment onward, he was a vessel of meaning, a body destined to carry the empire's warning into the eyes of the people. His steps, his silence, even the rhythm of his breathing were no longer his own. They belonged to the ritual that transformed crime into example, man into message. Thus began the slow and silent march toward the place of execution. The streets through which the condemned was led did not need to be filled with shouts. The spectacle lay not in noise, but in quiet recognition. Shopkeepers paused in their weighing of goods, hands hovering over scales as the procession passed. Farmers, bringing their baskets of grain to market, shifted their weight and lowered their eyes. Children clutched at their mothers' robes, peering out from behind fabric to glimpse the figure who walked at the centre of the slow-moving line. No cries of protest rose, for protest itself was dangerous. Instead, there was a stillness that followed the condemned like a shadow. The march began at the courts, where walls still held the echo of his sentence. Guards fastened ropes about his wrists, sometimes chains about his ankles, though these were not always necessary. Few resisted, for resistance against the Empire's decree was futile. He was led forward not with the urgency of soldiers driving a captive, but with the calm inevitability of men fulfilling duty. The condemned did not stumble quickly toward death. He drifted toward it, step by step, as though the weight of his fate pressed him into the earth. Spectators did not need to be summoned. Word travelled faster than any herald. By dawn, whispers had already spread through the city that a traitor or blasphemer was to be brought to the square. Men closed their shutters more slowly, deliberately leaving a crack to glimpse the march. Women arranging vegetables at their stalls leaned forward as the line approached. Even the beggars, who usually cried out for coins, grew quiet, sensing that this silence promised more than their own hunger could compete with. The condemned himself became part of the spectacle long before the square came into view. His clothes marked him, stripped of dignity, sometimes torn deliberately, to show the fall from status to shame. His hair might be dishevelled, his skin already bruised from confinement, his posture bent under the invisible burden of the sentence he carried. Yet more than his appearance, it was the silence around him that spoke loudest. The guards did not chatter. The crowd did not jeer. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if listening for the sound of steps that marked the slow approach of justice. Every march followed familiar patterns, though no two were identical. Some passed through narrow alleys where walls leaned close, trapping the figure between stone and shadow. Others crossed broad avenues lined with carved gates, where banners fluttered above like silent witnesses. In both cases the effect was the same. The condemned was placed on display, his body framed by the world he had betrayed. The Empire did not need to remind the people of its power. It showed it with each step of this march, letting the condemned himself bear the weight of the lesson. To walk toward execution was not to move freely. The condemned often walked slowly, whether from weakness or from the knowledge that each step shortened the distance to the end. The chains rattled softly. The rope creaked with every shift of the wrists. The guards' boots struck stone with a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic. And always, around them, the city fell into stillness, broken only by the soft murmur of cloth, the faint rustle of wind, the heartbeat of anticipation. The condemned rarely spoke. If he did, his words were swallowed by the enormity of silence. Some muttered prayers to gods who no longer seemed near. Others whispered apologies or curses under their breath. But most walked in mute surrender, their voices already taken by the inevitability of what lay ahead. The silence of the march was not imposed by guards or by decree. It was born from the weight of fear, which pressed against every throat until words had no strength to rise. Children sometimes followed at a distance, too young to understand fully, but old enough to sense the gravity. Their small feet padded along behind the crowd, mimicking the slow steps of the condemned, their eyes wide with the mixture of fear and fascination that only innocence can hold. They would carry the memory with them, retelling it in fragments to one another in hushed tones, ensuring that even those who had not seen would still feel the presence of the march. For the condemned, the path itself seemed endless. The square might be only a short distance from the court, yet each step stretched time, drawing moments longer than minutes. The sound of his own breathing grew louder, mingling with the faint shuffle of the crowd, the clink of chains, the soft snap of banners in the wind. The journey was not a mere transfer of a prisoner. It was the slow unravelling of identity. With each step, the condemned ceased to be a man and became more fully the embodiment of crime punished, law fulfilled, order restored. And then, gradually, the square emerged. Stone widened beneath the feet. The press of walls gave way to open space. Here, the silence shifted into a new form, not absence, but expectation. People had already gathered, some arriving hours earlier, to secure their place near the front. The square itself was like a stage, bordered by wooden structures, sometimes adorned with imperial banners, always prepared for the ritual of death. As the condemned entered, the murmur of the crowd swelled briefly, then fell once more into quiet, like the drawing of a breath before the strike of a drum. The march ended not with suddenness but with inevitability. The condemned was positioned at the centre, surrounded by guards, his body now more symbol than flesh. He stood, or knelt, if too weak, before the crowd, the silence still heavy, pressing upon every chest. The journey had carried him from the judgment of the courts to the theatre of the people, from whispered decree to visible warning. His march was over, but its silence lingered, settling over the square like a veil. For those who had watched, the memory of the march remained long after the man himself was gone. They recalled not only the figure of the condemned, but the stillness of the city, the way the world seemed to pause as he passed. In that pause lay the true weight of the empire's power, the unspoken reminder that law was not only written in ink and seal, but walked in flesh through the streets, step by step, until it reached its appointed end. The silent march was itself a punishment, stretching the moments before death into a spectacle of waiting. It reminded all who watched that the empire's reach extended not only into the final act of execution, but into every step that led toward it. To see the condemned walk in silence was to see the law embodied, to feel its weight pressing down upon the earth. And as the crowd stood in hushed anticipation, they understood that the silence would soon be broken, not by shouts or cries, but by the slow and deliberate ritual that would follow. The condemned did not arrive at the place of punishment as a free body to be suddenly undone by the blade. Their undoing began much earlier, in the quiet, deliberate rituals that transformed a man into something less than human. Before the first cut was ever made, the body was already being shaped, bound, and displayed in a way that reminded everyone watching that this punishment was not about the swiftness of justice, but about the theatre of control. It often began in a cold chamber where the prisoner was prepared. The walls of such rooms were plain, their silence broken only by the rustle of guards' movements and the faint scrape of metal against stone. Heavy ropes, coarse and rough to the touch, were laid out like the instruments of a craftsman. Alongside them, iron cuffs and bars glinted faintly in the dim light, not polished, but worn from repeated use. These were not ornaments of justice, but tools designed for a singular purpose: to restrain without mercy. The ropes were never knotted carelessly. Each loop was tied with practiced precision, coiling around wrists, elbows, and ankles in a sequence that reflected centuries of custom. The texture of the fibres dug into the skin, leaving marks that would outlast the moment. It was not only restraint, but humiliation, an exposure of helplessness, turning even the strongest of men into something fragile. The condemned were positioned in such a way that they could walk, but never with freedom. Every step was measured, every movement bound to the will of those who controlled the ropes. Iron restraints added another layer of weight to the ritual. Shackles clasped around the ankles, their chill seeping deep into the bone, ensured that the march would never be swift. They were heavy enough to drag against the ground, creating a slow, dragging sound that echoed in corridors or across the earth as the prisoner was led out. Chains joined wrist to wrist, sometimes linking them to the neck or waist, reducing the prisoner's posture into a bent, burdened form. It was a visual degradation, a way to make the condemned appear less than whole before ever reaching the stage of execution. The ritual itself carried meaning beyond the mechanics of bondage. In the eyes of the state, each rope and iron clasp was a mark of authority. It showed that the emperor's will extended beyond words and edicts. It reached down into the very flesh of the condemned, controlling even their smallest gestures. Bound tightly, the prisoner was no longer an individual, but a vessel of punishment, a body marked for transformation into a spectacle. For those who witnessed the binding, the act carried a heavy symbolism. Ropes were not simply ties. They were reminders of fate's grip. Iron was not simply metal. It was the hardness of imperial power. The onlookers, guards, scribes, and sometimes curious eyes allowed to watch, saw in these rituals the stripping away of a man's dignity, step by step. To see someone bound so fully was to be reminded of what awaited anyone who stepped too far beyond the limits of obedience. The process was slow, intentionally so. Each restraint was applied not with haste, but with ceremony, as though each tightening of rope was a verse in a silent chant. The prisoner's breathing often grew heavier during this time, not from exertion, but from the awareness that every knot tied and every shackle locked was another step closer to the irreversible. It was not pain in this moment, but anticipation, a weight pressing on the spirit. The condemned could feel the inevitability tightening around them just as surely as the rope. Sometimes the ropes would be arranged in elaborate patterns across the body, creating not only control but display. The bound man became an object of attention, his form shaped and held for the gaze of others. The execution ground was not yet in sight, but already the prisoner's body had been transformed into part of the performance. These bindings made escape not only impossible, but unimaginable, as though the body itself no longer belonged to the person within it. Iron cuffs were locked with dull clicks that sounded heavier than they were. The moment of closure, when the shackles snapped around an ankle or wrist, echoed like a small judgment, final in its simplicity. These sounds carried a strange permanence. They were the audible signs that freedom had already ended. To hear them was to understand that the condemned was already halfway into death, caught between the world of the living and the shadow of what was to come. As the guards tightened the final restraints, the prisoner often stood in silence. Struggle was rare, not because it was impossible, but because futility had already seeped in. What could be gained from resistance when the cords were so many, the iron so heavy, and the eyes of authority so watchful? Still, some carried a subtle defiance in their posture, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the gaze. Yet even these traces were swallowed by the relentless binding, until the body was no longer capable of expression except through the heaviness of its own restraint. The ritual of rope and iron was not confined to a single room. Once the prisoner was bound, they were led outward, and the restraints became part of the march. Each step was marked by the drag of iron on the earth, a rhythm of weight and submission. The ropes pulled the prisoner forward, jerking slightly with each movement, as though to remind him that even his gait no longer belonged to him. Those who watched from doorways or alleys as the procession passed would see not just a man, but a lesson in motion, a body carrying the message of imperial justice through the streets. This slow march often lasted longer than the journey itself. What mattered was not the distance, but the display. The condemned was made to move in a manner that revealed his helplessness, giving the crowd ample time to absorb the sight. Children would stare wide-eyed, merchants would pause from their dealings, and whispers would run through the gathered faces. Each set of ropes and irons told them the same story, that the Empire's hand could fall upon anyone, binding them from within and without. Even as the condemned drew nearer to the place where death awaited, the ritual of restraint never lost its weight. The ropes cut deeper into the skin with each movement, leaving raw impressions. The iron cuffs chafed against bone, rubbing sore spots that grew worse with every step. The body itself became a canvas of marks, a preview of the greater suffering yet to come. Pain began long before the executioner's blade, drawn slowly out through the grip of rope and the drag of metal. Yet beyond the pain was the silence of inevitability. The condemned, bound and weighted, walked not as a man who might return, but as a figure already claimed by history. The restraints were not only practical, but symbolic. They marked the passage from life into death, binding not only the body, but the memory of the person, fixing them in place for the final act. As the march continued, the sight of the bound figure blended into the memory of countless others who had walked before under the same weight. The ritual was not new, nor was it unique. It was a tradition repeated over centuries, each time adding to the long tapestry of fear woven into the empire's history. Each rope tied, each shackle fastened, was another thread in that vast and enduring pattern. By the time the condemned reached the execution grounds, the ritual of restraint had done its work. The body was exhausted, the spirit pressed down, the crowd prepared for what was to follow. The ropes and irons had not only held the prisoner, they had held the attention of all who saw, ensuring that what came next would not be seen as the isolated end of a single man, but as the fulfillment of a ritual that began long before the blade was drawn. The punishment itself would come, sharp and slow, but already the lesson had been delivered. Rope and iron, in their silence, had spoken loudly enough. The condemned was not alone on the long walk toward punishment. At first there were only guards at his side, their steps steady, their faces unreadable. But as the chains scraped against stone and the sound of rope pulled taut echoed outward, the space around him began to fill. People came quietly, some leaving their homes, others pausing their labour, until the path grew thick with human presence. The punishment was not meant to unfold in secrecy. It was meant to be seen, and so the crowd assembled, pulled not by invitation, but by the slow magnetism of fear and curiosity. The morning sky often matched the tone of the event. Pale, overcast and heavy with grey clouds, it carried no warmth. The air itself seemed to dull the senses, as though even nature recoiled from what was to come. Yet the dullness was not enough to keep the people away. They gathered in silence at first, their bodies forming clusters along the path, the muted tones of their clothing blending into the bleakness of the day. They stood shoulder to shoulder, yet each person's thoughts were their own, weighed with unease, anticipation, or grim fascination. There was no carnival atmosphere, no joyous noise of distraction. The gathering was quiet, broken only by whispers that clung to the air like the chill mist of morning. Parents hushed their children, telling them to keep their eyes open, for this too was a lesson handed down through generations. The young learned early that law was not an abstraction, it had a body and it bled. The old watched with the weariness of memory, having seen other men walk this same path before, knowing the cycle of fear would not end with this single life. Merchants, scholars, farmers, beggars, all came, as though drawn by the gravity of the state itself. The punishment was not only for the condemned, it was for every pair of eyes that would carry the image home. The emperor's reach extended far beyond palace walls, and here, in the bodies of the onlookers, his authority was renewed. To stand beneath the grey sky and watch was to be reminded that even the most ordinary life rested on the fragile edge of obedience. As the condemned drew closer, the murmur of voices thinned until silence fell like a heavy cloth over the gathering. The sound of iron chains dragging across the earth grew louder in its place, a slow and unrelenting rhythm. The figure of the prisoner came into focus, roped and shackled, guided forward by guards whose expressions betrayed no feeling. The people leaned in, not out of cruelty, but because the human eye cannot help but seek the face of one about to be undone. Some turned away almost immediately, unable to meet that gaze. Others stared with unblinking intensity, as though trying to carve the sight into their memory. Fear and fascination intertwined in the crowd's stillness. They had not come merely to witness suffering, but to measure the thin line that separated themselves from the man walking under restraint. Each cut that awaited him was a warning carved not only into his flesh, but into the collective memory of those who watched. The presence of the crowd gave the ritual its weight. Without witnesses, the punishment would be an act of violence. With them, it became a message. The silence of hundreds of eyes carried more force than the executioner's knife. No voice was raised in protest. No hand reached forward to intervene. They knew the consequences too well. Intervention meant sharing the condemned's fate. To remain was to obey, and so obedience grew deeper, rooted in the grey soil of fear. Even the weather seemed to conspire in shaping the moment. The clouds hung lower, as if pressing the people toward the earth, forcing their shoulders into stillness. The light was dim, flattening the world into shades of muted colour. In this half-light, the condemned's figure appeared almost spectral, neither fully alive nor yet claimed by death. The air was damp, carrying the faint metallic tang of iron and the earthy smell of trampled ground. These were not grand details, but they worked together to carve the memory of the scene into every witness present. Children, despite the warnings of their parents, peeked between arms and shawls to glimpse what they were told never to forget. Their eyes widened, not yet fully capable of understanding law or empire, but sensing instinctively the weight of power in the ropes, the chains, and the silent march. Some would cry quietly, burying their faces in their mother's sleeve, while others watched with grim stillness, learning early that fear could be sharper than hunger. The scholars among the crowd noted the ritual with quiet calculation. To them, this was more than punishment. It was a statement of order, an affirmation that chaos would always be bound by authority. Yet even they, with their trained minds, felt the heaviness of dread, for scholarship did not shield one from the reality of a body about to be cut apart. Knowledge might explain the law, but it could not ease the tightening in the chest, as the condemned stumbled forward beneath the sky. The condemned himself felt the presence of the onlookers as a weight even greater than the iron he bore. Every step was watched, every tremor noted. In the quiet of the crowd, his own breathing grew louder, his own heartbeat pounding like a drum no one else could hear. The ropes bound his flesh, but the stares of the people bound his spirit. He was no longer a man walking toward death. He was an example, stretched out under the eyes of all. His fate consumed by the watching silence. The execution ground came into sight, and the crowd pressed closer, not daring to touch the guards or the prisoner, but closing the circle nonetheless. They wanted to see, because seeing was survival. To turn away too soon was to risk forgetting the shape of fear, and forgetting might lead to mistakes. Better to carry the image home, to let it live in memory as a private warning, than to risk straying too far from obedience. Among the murmurs, there were no cheers, no jeers. The gathering was solemn, almost ritualistic in its stillness. The punishment was too grave for mockery, too drawn out for celebration. Each onlooker carried their own story of why they stood beneath the grey sky, but together they formed a silent audience, the necessary counterpart to the condemned suffering. Without them, the knife would cut only flesh. With them, it cut into the soul of the nation. As the condemned reached the centre, the guards halted. The ropes held him steady. The irons kept him from collapsing. Around him, the crowd thickened, bodies pressing forward just enough to see, but not enough to cross the invisible line that separated participant from spectator. The grey sky above gave no sign, no break of light or shadow, only the steady, indifferent blanket of cloud. The moment hung suspended, heavy with expectation. The condemned lifted his eyes, whether from instinct or resignation, no one could say. In that brief gaze upward, the crowd seemed to inhale as one, as though the motion had broken the stillness of the scene. Then, just as quickly, silence returned, deeper than before. The grey sky offered no comfort, only the certainty that what was about to unfold would leave its mark, not just on the body of the man before them, but on everyone who watched. The gathering was complete, the stage was set. The punishment would not belong to the condemned alone, it would live in the eyes of all who stood beneath those low and unyielding clouds. The ground where the condemned was led was not chosen by accident. It was a space prepared long before he arrived, a place shaped by ritual and intention. To call it a stage is not to suggest performance in the sense of art or entertainment, but to recognise the deliberate construction of a setting where punishment could be displayed and remembered. Every detail, from the positioning of the platform to the distance between guards, had meaning. It was not chaos, but order. Not spontaneity, but careful design. The execution ground was often bare, stripped of decoration, the earth packed hard beneath countless feet that had gathered there before. Yet in its starkness lay its purpose. A wooden platform, simple but elevated, stood at the centre, raised just enough for the body of the condemned to be seen by all. The platform was not grand. It was weathered by time, its boards scarred by use, its surface darkened by stains that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. Those marks were not hidden, for they served as silent reminders that others had stood there, bound and waiting. The air on such grounds felt different, as though charged with a weight unseen. The murmurs of the crowd quieted the moment the prisoner was positioned upon the platform, the act of elevation transforming him from a man among men into the focal point of a collective gaze. To stand there was to be separated forever from ordinary life. The ropes pulled tighter, the chains rattled, and with each adjustment by the guards, the condemned was bound not only to wood and iron, but to the eyes of everyone present. The placement of the platform at the centre ensured that no witness was excluded. The Emperor's justice, if it was to be feared, had to be visible. The poorest beggar and the wealthiest merchant alike were drawn into the circle, equal in their role as spectators. The condemned suffering was to be absorbed by every rank of society, making the lesson universal. The stage was both physical and symbolic. It lifted one man up in order to press countless others down beneath the weight of fear. The executioner's tools were laid out nearby, not yet touched, but already felt. Blades rested on a small table, their surfaces catching what little light filtered through the grey sky. They were not extravagant, nor did they need to be. Sharpness was their only virtue, and the people knew that each one had been honed for a purpose that was more than killing. For death could be quick, but this punishment demanded time. The stage existed so that suffering could be prolonged, and the instruments of pain were arranged with deliberate care to honour that demand. At the edges of the platform, guards stood unmoving, their spears angled like silent sentinels. Their presence reminded the crowd that this was not merely about one man and his crime, it was about the structure of power itself. The guards, the ropes, the blades, and the crowd were all parts of the same machinery. Without one piece, the ritual would falter. With all present, the spectacle unfolded as intended, ordered, controlled, and heavy with meaning. The condemned's position on the stage was fixed, neither reclining nor free to collapse. Ropes held him upright, forcing his body to remain visible, even if exhaustion or fear threatened to overcome him. His face was exposed, his limbs arranged for access. He could not shield himself, nor could he disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. Every angle was chosen so that his body became both victim and lesson, marked for disassembly before the eyes of all. Silence deepened as the crowd adjusted to this new arrangement. No one needed to be told that the stage was sacred in its own grim way. Children who had whispered moments before fell quiet. Even the restless shifting of feet slowed, as though the ground itself demanded stillness. All attention was drawn upward, not by force, but by the inescapable pull of what was about to unfold. The architecture of fear required this stage. Without elevation, the condemned's suffering would be hidden by the press of bodies. Without centrality, the lesson would scatter, diluted by distance. The stage was not for the comfort of the executioners, but for the memory of the people. What happened upon those worn boards would live longer than the cries of the man bound to them. The image would travel back to homes, whispered in markets, carried in stories across years, feeding the empire's hold without the need for constant swords. There was no canopy, no shelter above the stage. The grey sky hung directly overhead, pressing down upon the scene. Rain, if it came, fell without hindrance. Wind, if it rose, cut cold against bare skin. The elements were part of the ritual. Indifferent, yet unyielding, they reminded the people that nature itself offered no refuge from the emperor's will. Whether under sun, cloud, or storm, the punishment continued, unmoved by mercy. As the condemned shifted slightly, the ropes creaked. That faint sound seemed amplified in the stillness, carrying to the edges of the crowd. It reminded them of fragility, the frailty of skin, the inevitability of what was to follow. Each groan of wood beneath the prisoner's weight seemed to echo the strain of a human body pushed toward its limit. The stage itself became part of the voice of punishment, speaking through the sounds of tension and pressure. No banners waved above the scene, no music accompanied the ritual. It was stripped of ornament because none was needed. The stage itself was enough, its bare boards standing as a silent proclamation that the empire required no embellishment to make its message clear. Authority was not gilded. It was carved into flesh, etched into the collective memory of those who stood beneath the grey sky. Even the condemned, though his mind was consumed by fear, must have felt the meaning of that elevation. To be placed at the centre, to stand upon a platform raised for suffering, was to understand that his body had become more than his own. It belonged now to the empire, to the crowd, to the history that would remember his end more than it remembered his life. The ropes ensured he could not resist that transformation. The stage ensured no one could look away. Around the edges, whispers occasionally flickered back to life, hushed exchanges between neighbours. Some spoke of the crime, others of the emperor's justice, still others of the executioner's skill. Yet all voices carried the same undertone, a mixture of dread and reluctant acceptance. The punishment was cruel, but cruelty was its purpose. The stage was the empire's voice made visible, louder than any decree, deeper than any threat spoken in words. The platform, though modest in size, seemed immense to those who watched. It was not measured in feet or spans, but in the weight it carried. Every man who mounted it carried the shadow of countless others before him, each cut adding to the memory embedded in its wood. The stains upon it were not cleaned away because they were part of the stage's truth. To stand there was to stand within history itself, another name absorbed into the silence of fear. The condemned's breathing quickened as the crowd pressed closer, as the executioner moved to his place, as the grey sky lowered further. Each sound, each movement was absorbed by the stage, amplified by its centrality. The air grew thick, as though even the wind paused to bear witness. The stage did not comfort, did not shield, did not forgive. It existed only to display, to elevate pain until it became something larger than the man enduring it. And so the condemned stood there, roped and bound, chains pressing against flesh, eyes of hundreds fixed upon him. The stage held him, and in holding him, held everyone else as well. It was not only a platform of wood, but a platform of memory, where human suffering was shaped into something enduring, something carried away by each person beneath the grey sky. The crowd did not know how long the punishment would last, nor how many cuts it would take before death claimed the prisoner. But they knew this. The stage was built not for the comfort of the man upon it, but for the permanence of the fear it inspired. Long after the ropes rotted, long after the boards splintered and were replaced, the idea of that stage would remain. It was the Empire's true monument, not carved from stone, but carved into memory, built from the suffering of men who stood where the condemned now stood, beneath a sky that gave no mercy. The executioner did not rush. His presence alone was enough to draw the crowd into deeper stillness. He stepped forward with the calmness of a man who had performed this role countless times, yet without any trace of weariness. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as though the act before him demanded the precision of ritual rather than the haste of violence. The tools at his side gleamed faintly, their edges sharpened not to end life swiftly, but to unravel it piece by piece. The condemned, bound tightly by rope, stood unmoving on the platform. His chest rose and fell, a rhythm out of sync with the silence pressing in from all sides. His eyes flickered between the grey sky above and the figure approaching him, but there was no escape in either direction. The ropes ensured his body could not resist, and the crowd ensured his fear could not remain private. Every breath, every twitch of muscle, belonged now to the gaze of hundreds. The executioner's hand hovered above the first blade, pausing not in hesitation, but in ceremony. The act required timing. The first cut was not simply the opening of flesh. It was the moment when the punishment shifted from anticipation into reality. It carried a weight unlike the cuts that followed, for it was the threshold between life as it had been and life as it was about to become. When the blade was lifted, its reflection caught in the dim light. The crowd seemed to inhale as one. Not a single word was spoken. Not a single movement disturbed the air. The condemned closed his eyes briefly, the last private gesture left to him. Then, with a motion both swift and controlled, the blade met flesh. The first cut was shallow. It was never intended to kill. Instead, it traced across the skin like a signature, marking the beginning of a long descent. The sound of it was almost imperceptible, a faint tearing beneath the creak of rope and the quiet rustle of clothing in the breeze. Yet to those watching, the moment carried a force far greater than its sound. They saw the flinch ripple through the prisoner's body, saw the tightening of jaw and chest as pain first entered the ritual. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The condemned drew in a sharp breath, the first cry caught in his throat. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but density. A silence so heavy it pressed upon every listener, amplifying the smallest sound. When at last a low groan escaped the condemned's lips, it cut through the stillness like thunder through fog. The crowd shuddered inwardly, yet no one moved. They were bound by their own invisible ropes, tied to the scene unfolding before them. The first cut had always been more than physical. It was a test. It measured how much strength remained in the prisoner, how much silence he could hold before sound escaped. It measured the endurance of the crowd as well, testing how many could keep their gaze steady before turning away. Some lowered their eyes at that moment, ashamed of the fascination that drew them to watch. Others leaned closer, compelled to witness the transformation of a man into a vessel of suffering. Blood appeared in thin lines, tracing paths along the condemned skin, glistening in the dim light. It was not a flood, not yet. The punishment was careful, precise, meant to unfold slowly. But even that small streak of red was enough to shift the air among the watchers. They saw life itself leaving the body in fragments, drawn out by the sharp edge of steel. The condemned opened his eyes again, blinking against the sting of pain. His breathing grew louder, ragged, the ropes holding his body steady against the instinct to recoil. He did not collapse, for collapse was impossible. The bindings forced him upright, ensuring that every cut would be visible, every tremor of his muscles laid bare. His suffering was not only endured but displayed, transformed into a lesson that seeped into the silence around him. The executioner remained steady, his face unreadable. He did not linger on the wound he had made, nor did he rush to create the next. His role demanded control above all. Too swift a hand would end the life too soon. Too hesitant a hand would disrupt the rhythm of fear. The first cut had opened the path, and now the silence deepened, preparing for what must follow. The crowd shifted slightly, the sound of feet against earth mingling with the ragged breaths of the condemned. No one spoke. To speak would have been to break the sanctity of the moment, to shatter the fragile tension that held everyone together. Instead, they listened to the quiet groans, the subtle rasp of chains, the faint hiss of blood against skin. These became the language of the stage, words unspoken yet fully understood. Children clung to their parents, some burying their faces, others peeking with wide eyes at the spectacle. The lesson was not lost on them, even if the details blurred in their young minds. They would remember the silence most of all. The silence that fell over hundreds as one man's skin was broken by a blade. That memory, more than the image of blood itself, would remain long after the day ended. The condemned's groan turned into a low, steady rhythm, neither scream nor silence, but something caught between the two. Each sound carried across the platform, through the crowd, into the heavy air. It was the sound of endurance unravelling, of strength tested by pain that was only beginning. And still the silence of the onlookers held, their faces blank, their eyes fixed, their bodies stiffened against the dread curling through their veins. The first cut lingered in memory, because it marked the point of no return. Before it, there was always the faint possibility that the punishment might end before beginning, that mercy might intervene. After it, all such illusions vanished. The condemned was no longer a man awaiting judgment. He was a body set upon a path from which no step could be retraced. The Empire's hand had already pressed its mark into his flesh, and the rest would follow without pause. The executioner lowered his blade for a moment, resting it briefly against the table beside him. His eyes did not wander. His movements never faltered. He allowed the silence to stretch, to deepen, giving the crowd time to absorb what had begun. In this stillness, the punishment grew heavier than the cut itself. The anticipation of what would come next pressed more sharply than steel. The condemned's chest rose sharply, his breath trembling as though each inhalation burned. His gaze flickered once more across the mass of faces, searching for something he could not find. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. But the eyes that met his were blank, mirrors reflecting his pain back at him. Whatever humanity remained in the crowd was locked away, sealed beneath fear. They watched, but they did not answer. They listened, but they did not speak. The first cut remained visible on his skin. The blood seeping slowly downwards, its path unhurried, its presence undeniable. That line, thin yet sharp, was the beginning of his end. It was also the Empire's handwriting, inscribing upon his body the lesson intended for all. The silence that followed was its punctuation, a pause that carried more meaning than any word. And so the stage held steady. The crowd remained bound in quiet dread, and the condemned stood bleeding beneath the grey sky. The first cut had been made. Its echo lingered not in sound, but in the breathless stillness that followed, as though the entire world had paused to watch the unravelling of a single human life. The silence was not empty. It was full of fear, full of weight, full of the knowledge that what had begun would not end swiftly. The first cut was only the beginning, and the silence that followed was only the first of many. The air hung heavy around the stage, as if even the sky itself resisted moving forward. What had begun with the first stroke of steel did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it unfolded with the cruel patience of ritual. The executioner did not hurry. He was as much a custodian of time as he was a wielder of blades. And in this punishment, time was not measured in hours or minutes, but in the shallow slices that accumulated one atop the other. The condemned remained upright, ropes straining against the pull of his body as he swayed under the burden of pain. His breathing, once sharp and urgent, slowed into ragged gulps, each exhalation carrying the weight of agony. He no longer fought against the ropes. They had become the only thing keeping him from collapsing into the earth. The next cut came not with suddenness, but with inevitability. The executioner lifted his hand again, drawing the blade across another portion of skin, careful to avoid depth, careful to prolong rather than to end. It was a small cut, almost insignificant if judged by the measure of wounds seen in battlefields or brawls. Yet here, under the watchful silence of hundreds, it became enormous. The prisoner shuddered, a tremor passing through muscle and bone, and a low groan slipped from his throat. Blood flowed a little more this time, darker than the first, tracing erratic patterns as it slid downward. The crowd leaned forward without realizing it, their faces pale, their eyes fixed. There was no cheering, no outcry. What bound them to this moment was not excitement, but gravity. They were held by the slow unravelling of life. The spectacle of endurance stretched thin. The punishment demanded rhythm, a slice, a pause, a groan, a silence. Each cut was spaced apart by breath, by stillness, by the careful pacing of inevitability. Too fast, and the act would lose its purpose. Too slow, and the crowd would drift into impatience. The executioner's mastery lay not only in his hand with the blade, but in his ability to control the passage of time. And so time began to take on a new form. It was not the measured ticking of unseen clocks, but the steady beat of human suffering. Every flinch became a moment, every gasp a marker. The condemned's body was no longer his own. It was a canvas upon which the Empire painted its lesson stroke by stroke. The condemned's face grew hollow, his eyes half closed yet still awake. His lips parted, sometimes for groans, sometimes for the sharp hiss of breath as new pain carved into old. Sweat mingled with blood, dripping onto the wooden boards beneath him. The platform itself became a participant, darkening with stains, creaking beneath the shifting of ropes and the trembling of flesh. Around the stage, the crowd held their silence like a vow. Their lives, ordinary and fleeting, intersected here with the extraordinary weight of imperial justice. Some tried to look away, but their eyes returned, pulled back by the rhythm of blade and breath. Others studied the condemned closely, searching for meaning in the way his body responded. Was he weakening? Was he resisting? Was he clinging still to the faint thread of life? Children hid behind their mothers' sleeves, peeking through small gaps. Merchants and farmers stood shoulder to shoulder, their usual concerns of trade and harvest momentarily erased by the sight before them. Officials lingered at the edges, their expressions patois. Yet even they could not escape the pull of the stage. In the stillness of that grey day, all were united in witnessing a life unstitched in fragments. Cut followed cut, some across the arms, where veins swelled faintly beneath skin, others along the chest, shallow enough to sting without striking deep. The condemned jolted with each one, his body betraying the pain he tried to contain. His cries grew louder, then weaker, then louder again, forming a cadence that matched the executioner's steady hand. The slow unravelling was not only of flesh, but of time itself. Hours stretched indistinguishably. For the condemned, each moment must have felt like an eternity, stretched and distorted by pain. For the crowd, time seemed suspended, caught in the endless repetition of blade against skin, groan against silence. The day neither advanced nor receded. It hovered in place, held captive by the ritual unfolding upon the wooden platform. The executioner never spoke. His silence was as deliberate as his movements. To speak would have been to humanize the act, to acknowledge it as a choice rather than a duty. His face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, not even on the condemned's face, but on the flesh before him. His world narrowed to the next cut, the next pause, the next tremor in muscle and vein. The condemned's mind, though unseen, seemed to wander somewhere between resistance and surrender. At times his eyes darted outward, searching among the crowd for a face he might recognize, some last anchor of connection. At other times his gaze fell inward, staring at nothing, as though retreating from the reality of his own disassembly. Pain fragmented his thoughts just as the blade fragmented his body, scattering both into pieces too small to gather again. Blood grew thicker on the boards, the smell beginning to rise in the air. The metallic tang mixed with sweat and dampness, a scent unmistakable and unforgettable. It settled into the nostrils of those who stood closest, clinging to them like a second skin. For the rest of their lives, they would remember that smell, would recall it whenever silence grew too deep. The unravelling was not meant only for the condemned. It reached outward, threading into the lives of all who stood beneath the grey sky. They bore witness, and in witnessing, they carried fragments of the punishment away with them. The Empire understood this well. Justice was not only about the one punished, but about the impression left on those who watched. As the cuts multiplied, the condemned's voice grew fainter. Where once groans had broken the silence, now only shallow gasps escaped. His body sagged in the ropes, no longer straining against them, but leaning into their restraint. Yet the executioner continued, undisturbed by the weakening of sound. The punishment was not about screams. It was about endurance, about how long flesh and time could hold together before unravelling completely. The day stretched on. Clouds shifted slowly above, casting dim light across the scene. Shadows lengthened, and still the rhythm continued. Steel against skin, silence against breath. The condemned had become more wound than man, his body marked by dozens of thin lines that crisscrossed and overlapped. Each one bled its own slow stream, each one contributing to the tapestry of pain woven across his form. The crowd grew restless not in impatience, but in unease. The sheer length of the act wore upon them, pressing into their minds like a weight they could not lift. Some shifted their feet, others clenched their hands, but none departed. To leave before the end would have been to reject the Empire's lesson, and that rejection was its own form of risk. So they stayed, bound not by rope but by fear, enduring in silence the slow unravelling alongside the man upon the platform. Time blurred. No one could have said how many cuts had been made, nor how many hours had passed. The punishment was designed precisely to blur such measures, to dissolve ordinary reckonings of time into the endless rhythm of pain. The condemned's life was no longer counted in years or days, but in slices of flesh, in the droplets of blood that fell one after another, like sand through an hourglass. At last, as the light shifted again, and the air grew heavier with the scent of iron, the condemned gave a sound unlike the groans before. It was low, broken, almost more sigh than cry. It drifted out into the silence, carried weakly, and then faded into the hum of the crowd's collective breath. His body swayed, his strength dissolving, yet still the executioner continued. For in this punishment, death was not a single moment. It was stretched across time, drawn out until the body could no longer hold against it. The condemned was unravelling, not only in flesh, but in spirit, his life spilling away slowly, almost reluctantly, as though even death itself had been commanded to proceed in fragments. And the crowd remained, watching, listening, breathing in silence as time unravelled before them. The lesson was written not in words, not even in decrees, but in the slowness of suffering, in the way a single human life could be taken apart piece by piece while the world stood still. The grey sky pressed lower, the platform creaked beneath its weight, and the condemned hung in the ropes, his body trembling as the executioner prepared once more. Time did not march forward. It dissolved, cut into fragments, scattered across the stage like drops of blood on the wood. The punishment was not yet finished. Flesh still held to bone, breath still clung to lungs, and the crowd still waited in silence. The unravelling would continue, as it always did, until there was nothing left to separate. Beneath the pale sky and the restless stillness of the crowd, the figure most studied was not always the condemned. In the slow rhythm of pain, another presence became the axis of the spectacle, the executioner himself. His movements, his posture, his silence, these gave shape to the ritual as much as the blade in his hand. Without him, the punishment would collapse into chaos. With him, it carried the weight of order, method, and inevitability. He stood close enough to feel the heat of the prisoner's body, close enough that each tremor passed into the air between them, but his expression betrayed no shift, no crack in composure. The executioner's face was neither cruel nor sympathetic. It was emptied of such things. It belonged not to a man, but to a role, carved out by generations of law and practice. To look upon him was to see the embodiment of the state's endurance, steady, unflinching, untouchable. The condemned's gasps and groans might stir pity in the hearts of those who watched, but the executioner remained unmoved. He adjusted his stance with quiet precision, tilting his weight as he prepared the next cut. The blade gleamed faintly, stained but not dulled, and his hand guided it with the same surety one might use in a daily craft. For him, the stage was a workshop, the body before him an unwilling canvas. Every movement spoke of routine, of practiced familiarity, as though the terrible act was less an outburst of violence than a measured craft passed down through time. It was not uncommon for the executioner to be seen as both feared and needed. Feared because he carried out what others could not even watch without trembling. Needed because the law demanded hands to give its commands flesh, and so his face bore the mark of this paradox. Ordinary features rendered extraordinary by their service to an extraordinary task. His eyes, dark and still, carried no flicker of doubt. His mouth neither tightened with cruelty nor softened with sorrow. He was a vessel emptied of the personal, filled only with duty. To those in the crowd, the executioner's stillness was more haunting than the prisoner's cries. Suffering was expected from the condemned. Indifference was expected from the executioner. Yet the sheer steadiness of that indifference pressed upon them like a second punishment. It reminded them that the empire's grip did not falter, that its enforcers did not hesitate. The condemned might falter, the crowd might tremble, but the hand with the blade did not. Children who peeked at the scene often found their gaze drifting from the broken figure in the ropes to the executioner's face. They studied it, searching for some human crack, some sign of strain or doubt. But the face gave nothing back. It was a mask of stillness, teaching them in silence that power required no emotion, only endurance. What they learned in those moments would stay with them long after their eyes closed for sleep. There were always murmurs that executioners lived apart, marked by their work, as though the weight of so many deaths clung to them like a shadow. Some claimed they aged faster, their hair turning grey before its time. Others believed they grew more silent with each act, carrying their profession in their bodies long after they left the platform. Yet in the moment of punishment itself, none of these speculations mattered. On the stage, the executioner was not a man with a past or a future. He was only the present, the steady hand that drew time out of flesh. He moved with an economy of motion that was unsettling in its lack of hesitation. When he reached for the prisoner's arm, he did so with the calmness of one who had done so 100 times before. When he lifted the blade, he did not rush, nor did he linger. His pace matched the rhythm demanded by law and tradition, a tempo that stretched suffering without exhausting spectacle. The punishment was as much performance as penalty, and he was its chief performer. The crowd could not help but compare his steadiness to their own unease. Where they shifted, he stood firm. Where they breathed shallowly, he drew breath evenly. Where their eyes darted with discomfort, his gaze remained fixed and unwavering. His presence was an anchor, holding the ritual in place, ensuring that it did not collapse under the weight of horror. The punishment demanded precision, and he provided it with an almost eerie calm. What thoughts passed behind his eyes no one could know. Did he remember the faces of those who came before? Did he carry their voices into the quiet of night? Or had he learned to silence memory, to let each act dissolve as soon as it was complete? The blankness of his face gave no answer. To those who watched, it seemed he had shed all remnants of self, leaving behind only the form of the task. The executioner's assistants too reflected this stillness. They held the ropes, adjusted the restraints, kept the condemned upright when weakness overtook him. Their faces mirrored their masters, serious, muted, disciplined. They did not exchange words, for words were unnecessary. Each movement had been rehearsed in countless acts before. Each gesture was a part of the ritual, woven seamlessly into the slow unspooling of punishment. In the silence between cuts, the crowd often found themselves staring at these faces more than the wounds themselves. For wounds told of pain, but faces told of endurance. The condemned's endurance was fading. The executioner's endurance remained absolute. It was this contrast that deepened the fear within the gathering. Pain they could imagine, for they all knew the fragility of flesh. But to face another's pain without flinching, that was something beyond their comprehension. And yet, the executioners were not immune to the passage of time. Their steadiness was a learned mask, hardened by repetition, enforced by necessity. Somewhere beneath the stillness lay men of flesh and blood, shaped into instruments of power. Perhaps their hearts still beat faster in those first moments of a cut. Perhaps their hands, when alone, trembled faintly with what memory carried. But none of this belonged on the stage. The stage demanded only stillness, and stillness it received. The condemned, swaying under the ropes, might have looked once upon the executioner's face, searching for something, pity, anger, recognition. If he did, he would have found nothing. The face offered no acknowledgement, only the steady gaze of a man completing a duty that would not falter. To the condemned, this blankness was perhaps the final cruelty. Pain could be endured if it was shared, but here it was met only with the emptiness of a mask. As the punishment dragged forwards, the executioner's role became not only to cut, but to preserve the rhythm of the act itself. His steady face reassured the officials who watched from the edges that order remained intact. His calm movements reminded the crowd that the Empire's power was not chaotic, but methodical, precise, and unrelenting. He was both a craftsman and a symbol, and the mask of his composure carried more weight than any shouted decree. The sky above shifted faintly, though the clouds remained. A bird circled once, its wings silent, and even that small motion seemed a contrast to the stillness below. The executioner did not look up, did not break his focus. His world was confined to the stage, to the condemned, to the unbroken line of duty. He stood as if carved from stone, only his hands moving, carrying out the ritual of 1,000 cuts with a patience that belonged not to one man, but to the long, heavy history that had shaped him. The crowd, bound by silence, continued to watch, their own faces betraying unease, pity, dread. But the faces of the executioners remained steady, unflinching, as though untouched by the weight of human suffering. They did not smile, they did not grimace. They endured as the condemned unravelled, as time itself bled slowly away beneath grey skies. And in that steadiness, the Empire revealed its lesson most clearly. Flesh might tremble, voices might falter, but the hand of authority would not shake. The condemned's body was undone, piece by piece, yet the executioner's faces did not shift. They stood as the embodiment of power itself, silent, disciplined, unyielding, while the crowd absorbed the truth, written not only in blood, but in composure. Thus, the punishment stretched forward, the blade rising and falling, the condemned swaying, and the faces of those who carried out the act remaining steady, unflinching, eternal in their stillness. The square was no longer a space of ordinary life. Its stones, worn smooth by the feet of merchants and children, had been transformed into a theatre of punishment. From every corner of the city, people had gathered. Some came with deliberate intention, rising before dawn to secure a place near the front. Others drifted in slowly, led by the murmur of voices and the pull of curiosity. By the time the condemned was bound, and the executioners stood in their patient formation, the square was alive with an energy that swelled and rippled like the tide. Faces filled every angle, faces lifted toward the platform, faces pressed together, faces shadowed by broad hats and cloaks. Farmers who smelled of the soil, merchants with rings still glinting from trade, beggars leaning on canes, children perched on the shoulders of their fathers. Together they formed a single body, a mass of eyes and breath, waiting. The crowd, in its density, seemed to exhale in rhythm. At moments, a hush would fall, a stillness carried by the collective recognition that something irreversible was about to unfold. Then the murmur would rise again, soft, uncertain, like the sound of distant insects at dusk. Fear and curiosity tangled in the air until they were indistinguishable. Each spectator carried their own reason for being there, but once gathered, those reasons dissolved into something larger, the simple act of watching. Among them were those who wished for justice. To them, the condemned was more than a man. He was a warning. His punishment was proof that order had teeth, that the laws of the empire were not mere words written on bamboo strips, but forces that could cut into the flesh and draw obedience through dread. These spectators nodded to themselves, lips tight, eyes steady, seeing in the punishment a form of reassurance that their world remained intact. Others came for reasons less solemn. A punishment like this was not common. The death of 1,000 cuts was reserved for those deemed most deserving of horror, and such occasions were rare enough to be spoken of long after the last stone in the square had cooled. Curiosity pulled people forward as surely as fear held them in place. They wanted to see with their own eyes what stories alone could not capture. They wanted to feel the sharpness of reality, as though witnessing it could settle some restless question within them. But beneath both justice and curiosity lay another layer, one harder to name. It was the fascination of the human spirit with extremes, the edge of cruelty, the depth of suffering, the point at which life flickers yet refuses to extinguish. That fascination drew the eyes of the young boy who leaned too far forward, his fingers clutching the rope that marked the boundary of the square. It drew the gaze of the old woman, whose wrinkles carried both pity and cold acceptance, as though she had seen enough life to know that cruelty was as natural as breath. The condemned stood bound, his body still whole, though his spirit already stretched thin by the weight of waiting. The silence that fell before the first act of the execution seemed to thicken the air. In that silence, the crowd became aware of itself. They could hear one another's breathing, the coughs suppressed, the nervous clearing of throats. They felt the proximity of hundreds pressed together, yet all gazes were fixed upon a single figure who bore the weight of their collective attention. A child whispered a question to his mother, but the words died in the stillness. An old man shifted his weight, the creak of his wooden cane echoing strangely loud. Then the hush deepened, not from order imposed by soldiers, but from something instinctive, as though everyone recognized that history itself was about to press down upon the square. When the executioner raised his hand, there was no shout, no chant, no roar of approval. There was only breath held back, as if the crowd itself was afraid to move, afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. The cut was made. It was small, precise, and deliberate. And in that moment, the silence broke, not into chaos, but into a wave of human sound, soft yet varied. Gasps slipped through lips, as if hundreds had inhaled sharply at once. A few murmurs rose, half-formed words that never reached clarity. Some eyes darted away for a moment, unable to hold the sight. Others leaned forward, unblinking, as though determined not to miss a single detail. What was revealed was not only the suffering of the condemned, but also the hidden nature of the crowd itself. Each reaction reflected the truths people carried within. Those who looked away did so because something within them recoiled at the intimacy of pain. Those who watched with unwavering eyes did so because something within them sought to measure the limits of endurance. Together, they formed a mirror of humanity's divided heart, the place where pity and fascination, horror and attraction live side by side. The murmurs spread slowly, like ripples across water. Some voices whispered prayers, perhaps for the soul of the condemned, perhaps for their own protection from such a fate. Others whispered observations, details about the executioner's steady hand, about the slowness of the method, about how long a man could live when death was made to take its time. In these whispers, the punishment grew beyond the stage. It became a story already being told, passed between lips, while the condemned was still alive. For the officials who stood at the edges of the crowd, This was the true function of the execution. Not the punishment itself, but the memory it planted in the hearts of those who watched. Fear was a seed, and the crowd was its soil. Each gasp, each whisper, each averted gaze was proof that the seed had taken root. Tomorrow, and for many tomorrows after, the story of what had been seen would travel through the city like a shadow. Yet fear was not the only thing sown. The spectacle created something else, a strange intimacy between strangers. For a moment, those pressed shoulder to shoulder were bound by more than proximity. They were bound by the knowledge of what they had seen together. This shared witnessing, though unspoken, formed a silent community. It was the kind of bond that did not need words, a bond carried in memory, heavy and private, but shared nonetheless. The execution continued, and with each cut, the crowd's responses shifted. The first had been shock, sharp and fresh. The second brought a deepened hush, as if the reality of repetition had settled in. By the third and fourth, murmurs rose again, not louder but steadier, as though the people were adjusting to the rhythm of what was unfolding. Some began to count quietly, marking each cut as though it were a ritual in itself. Others fell into a kind of stillness, their eyes glazed, caught between fascination and numbness. The sky, grey and heavy, seemed to lean lower as time stretched on. The air felt thicker, heavier, pressing against the crowd as much as the sight itself pressed into their minds. Still, no one left. No one turned their back on the platform. Even those who wished to look away found themselves pulled back, drawn by the gravity of suffering. It was here, in this balance between horror and attraction, that the execution's power truly lay. The condemned man suffered, but the crowd bore a different burden, the burden of witnessing, of carrying away the memory of each moment. In this way, the punishment extended beyond the body of the condemned, seeping into the hearts of all who gathered, ensuring that none could remain untouched. The officials knew this. The executioners knew it as well, and the people, though they would not name it, felt it too. The square was no longer just a place. It had become a vessel, carrying within it the strange, uneasy union of justice and spectacle, of fear and fascination, of cruelty and community. When the silence deepened once more, when the only sounds were the muted breath of the crowd and the quiet steps of the executioners, the realization settled like a shadow across every heart. They had become part of the punishment. Their eyes, their silence, their very presence were as much instruments of the ritual as the blades themselves. And so they remained, suspended between fascination and horror, watching as flesh and time stretched the limits of endurance, and as fear, quiet and steady, took root in the soil of memory. Time in the square no longer moved with the rhythm of ordinary life. It did not follow the passage of the sun or the chiming of bells. It bent itself instead to the pace of the blade. Each cut marked a fragment of time, small enough to be almost invisible, yet heavy enough to carry eternity within it. For the condemned, for the executioners, and for the watching crowd, the moments of pain seemed to extend far beyond their natural length, as though the very act of suffering reshaped the hours. The condemned man swayed faintly against the restraints, his body both alive and already unravelling. The ropes dug into his arms and legs, their fibres darkened by the slow seep of blood. His face no longer showed the sharp lines of defiance or fear. It had blurred into something quieter, a mask of exhaustion where breath alone kept him tethered to the earth. Every twitch, every shallow exhale was proof that life still clung, though the boundaries between living and dying had begun to blur. Pain, when stretched across so many moments, ceased to behave as an ordinary sensation. It was not a sudden flare that passed, nor a sharp edge that receded. It became a landscape, wide and unending, through which the condemned was forced to wander. His body shook not from any one wound, but from the sheer length of the ordeal, as though time itself had become the executioner, and the knife merely its tool. The executioners moved with the same calm they had carried since the beginning. Their eyes did not wander to the crowd, nor linger on the man's face. They worked with discipline, each stroke measured, each pause deliberate. Their task was not only to cut, but to pace the punishment so that pain remained stretched, pulled thin but unbroken. Too quick, and the man would be lost before the lesson had taken root. Too slow, and the spectacle would turn from dread to tedium. It was a balance, and in their steadiness lay the weight of long training. The crowd, pressed close beneath the grey sky, had grown quieter as the ordeal stretched on. At first they had gasped, murmured, shifted with the immediacy of shock. Now their stillness was different, not born of surprise, but of being held within a strange rhythm. Each cut, each faint groan, became part of a pattern, and within that pattern their own sense of time dissolved. Minutes lengthened, hours blurred. The execution seemed endless, as though the condemned had entered into a place where ordinary human limits no longer applied. Children who had fidgeted at the start now clutched their parents' hands in silence, their eyes wide but unreadable. Old men, their shoulders caked beneath years of labour, leaned more heavily on their canes but did not turn away. Even those whose hearts recoiled could not leave, for leaving meant carrying the weight of absence, of not knowing how it ended. The punishment drew them all into its orbit, holding them still even as their thoughts struggled to comprehend the enormity of pain stretched so thin. For the condemned, the body itself had become a vessel that betrayed him. Each cut did not merely open flesh, it pulled at memory and time alike, reminding him with every sting that life was still present, still refusing to slip away. There was cruelty in that persistence, in the way breath continued even as strength dissolved. His eyes opened and closed, heavy as stone, but each time they opened again, he found the same faces staring, the same grey sky above, the same endless moment repeating. In the distance, a bell tolled faintly, its sound carried by the wind. Yet to those gathered in the square, it felt misplaced, almost unreal, as though it belonged to another world where time moved as it should. Here the sound dissolved into the thick silence, swallowed by the weight of suffering. The crowd did not stir. They had forgotten, for now, that there was life beyond this square. The executioner's blades gleamed faintly, catching the pale light that seeped through the overcast sky. Each movement of their hands was deliberate, but also strangely detached, as though they were instruments of a larger design. They were not merely inflicting wounds, they were stretching existence itself, weaving pain into a thread that extended beyond the condemned man's body. That thread reached outward, to the crowd, to the officials who watched from their elevated place, and even to those who would hear of it in whispers carried through the city's narrow streets. The punishment was designed not only to end life, but to alter perception. Pain became more than sensation. It became memory, legend, and warning. The condemned suffered in the present, but the reach of his pain extended far beyond him, beyond the square, into a future where it would be retold and remembered. In this way, his suffering lived longer than his body, stretched beyond the living moment into something almost eternal. The crowd seemed to sense this, even if they could not name it. Their eyes held not only pity or horror, but also a kind of reluctant reverence, as though they stood in the presence of something larger than themselves. They were watching not merely a man's death, but the embodiment of the Empire's power. The reminder that even time itself could be bent by authority, drawn out to serve as a lesson. And still, the condemned breathed. His chest rose faintly, as though each inhale was borrowed, as though the body's refusal to let go was itself a form of defiance. The executioners, with their steady hands, ensured that he remained in that narrow space between life and death for as long as possible. It was here, in this suspension, that the true terror of the punishment lay, not in the cuts themselves, but in the endurance they demanded. The grey clouds above thickened, pressing low, their shadows deepening the solemnity of the square. No bird crossed the sky. No sound of commerce drifted from the streets. All that remained was the slow unravelling of one man's life, and the silent acknowledgement of all who bore witness. The crowd knew, in some unspoken way, that what they were seeing was not confined to this day alone. It would follow them. It would travel in their thoughts as they walked home, in their conversations whispered behind closed doors, in the restless stirring of dreams. The punishment extended beyond the condemned, beyond the platform, into every life that had paused to watch. Pain had become a presence that stretched, not only through the body bound in ropes, but into the very air they breathed. And as the executioners continued their work, and the man's body trembled against its bonds, the silence of the crowd deepened still further. They no longer reacted with gasps or whispers. They had entered the same suspended rhythm as the condemned, caught in the slow march of pain stretched beyond the living moment, unable to release themselves from its grip. The punishment was not only his, it belonged now to them all. The square had grown heavy with silence, a silence so deep that even the smallest sound seemed too sharp for it. The condemned man's breathing had slowed, each inhale a faint tremor, each exhale a whisper fading before it reached the air. His body had become something fragile and foreign, stretched between endurance and surrender, tethered by threads that seemed ready to break at any moment. The punishment had gone on for what felt like more than a lifetime, and now all that remained was the inevitable closing of it. The executioners, steady as stone, moved with the same practiced calm. Their blades were no longer cruel instruments, but the tools of conclusion, carrying with them the weight of ritual. Their faces revealed nothing of pity, nothing of haste, nothing of triumph. They had been trained for this role, to guide a man through suffering until life itself loosened its grip, and to do so without faltering. They did not cut with anger or with joy. They cut because the Empire demanded it, because the punishment required it, because death must arrive not in a sudden strike, but as the final release of a long unravelling. The condemned man's eyes flickered open once more, though sight had already dimmed. The crowd was a blur, the executioners mere shapes, the sky above only a smear of grey. He no longer resisted the ropes that bound him. His limbs, once tense, now hung with the heaviness of surrender. The fight was gone, not because he chose to give it up, but because time itself had drained it from him. What remained was a hollow kind of waiting, the fragile awareness that every breath might be the last. For the crowd, the moment of ending was both dreaded and inevitable. They had been drawn into the rhythm of the punishment, held by its strange gravity, but now they felt its pull slacken. The murmurs of the square had fallen away. There was no gasp, no shifting of feet, only the hush of anticipation. The onlookers knew that death was close, yet they could not predict the instant when it would arrive. Death, even stretched across countless cuts, still chose its own time. The executioners worked with the same precision as before, but their movements now carried a different weight. Where once each cut was measured to prolong, now the strokes leaned toward conclusion. The body before them trembled faintly with each touch of the blade. yet there was no longer the sharp recoil of pain. The condemned had passed into a place beyond the full reach of suffering, where sensation dulled and the mind drifted in and out of shadow. Pain had burned so long it had become something distant, like a storm once close that had now rolled far across the horizon. The air in the square thickened. Even the clouds seemed to still, hanging motionless above as though reluctant to move until the man's life was done. A single crow circled high, its wings cutting across the grey. It did not cry out, and the crowd, for a moment, lifted their eyes to watch it pass. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the distance, and all attention fell again upon the figure bound to the platform. His chest rose once more, then fell. It rose again, but weaker, uneven, as though the body itself debated whether to continue. Breath was no longer a rhythm, it was a negotiation, each inhale a question, each exhale an answer that might not return. The ropes that had held him upright now seemed to hold up a body that could no longer stand on its own. His face, streaked with blood and shadow, bore no expression, neither grimace nor cry. It had become the face of one who had already begun to step into silence. The officials seated at the edge of the square remained unmoving, their gazes sharp, their robes flowing like dark rivers. For them, the ending was as important as the beginning. The condemned's death would mark the closing of the punishment, the completion of a spectacle meant to uphold order. They watched not out of compassion, but out of duty, to ensure that justice, in its most terrible form, had been carried to its conclusion. The crowd, however, felt the moment differently. They had seen the long suffering, the endless cuts, the trembling endurance of a body kept alive for pain. Now, as the man's breath faltered, many among them felt a release rising within themselves. It was not joy, nor was it sorrow. It was the loosening of a weight they had carried as witnesses. His death, when it came, would free not only him, but also those who had stood bound in the quiet rhythm of his agony. The executioners made the final motions of their work. Their hands were steady, but the pace had shifted. No longer stretched, no longer delayed. The punishment now moved toward closure. They guided the condemned gently into the last space between life and death. Not with haste, but with certainty. The body trembled once more, faint and fleeting, like the last flicker of a candle fighting the pull of darkness. And then it ended. The chest did not rise again. The breath that slipped out carried with it the final thread of life, dissolving into the grey air as though it had never been. The ropes still held the body upright, but it was no longer a man, only the shell of one, emptied of its struggle, freed of its endurance. His head slumped forward, and silence deepened across the square. For a long moment, no one moved. The executioners lowered their blades. The officials remained as still as carved figures. The crowd, bound together by the shared weight of the punishment, lingered in the silence of death's arrival. They had waited so long for this release, and yet when it came, it felt almost unreal, too quiet for the enormity of what had passed. A whisper stirred at the edge of the square, faint as wind through reeds. Then another. And slowly, the sound of voices returned, hushed, uncertain, as though speech itself felt intrusive against the stillness of death. The crowd began to shift, some turning their heads, some lowering their eyes, some standing motionless as though unwilling to break free from the gravity of the moment. The executioners stepped back, their task complete. They did not look at the crowd nor at the officials. Their duty was done, and with it came no celebration, no lament, only the quiet certainty that they had fulfilled the Empire's command. They left the body where it hung, bound by the ropes that had once restrained life, but now merely held death upright. The grey sky above seemed heavier still, but the first drop of rain did not fall. Instead, the air lingered in its quiet, thick and unmoving, as though time itself paused to acknowledge the passing. The condemned man had endured longer than most would think possible, had carried his body through hours of pain, but in the end, death had arrived with the same finality it always carried. His suffering, however, did not end here. Though his breath had stopped, though his body no longer trembled, the memory of his pain lingered in every eye that had seen it. The crowd would carry it home. The officials would record it in their ledgers. The executioners would remember it in silence. The punishment had ended, but its echo had only begun, travelling outward into the city, into the empire, into the pages of history. For the condemned, the release into death was the end of all struggle. For those who had witnessed, it was a reminder that pain, once stretched so far, does not vanish with the closing of a life. It lingers, quiet but heavy, settling into memory as though carved there by an unseen hand. And as the square began to empty, and the body remained still beneath the weight of grey skies, the lesson of the punishment endured, terrible, unflinching, eternal. The square did not empty quickly. Even after breath had left the condemned, the stillness of his body held the crowd in place. Death had come, but the punishment lingered in its aftermath, as though the body itself continued to speak without words. Bound to the ropes, blood-stained and unmoving, the figure became more than a man. It became a symbol, a reminder etched not only into flesh, but into the memory of all who looked upon it. When the officials finally rose, their movements were precise, deliberate. Their long sleeves brushed the air as they gestured, signalling that the sentence was fulfilled. Yet the body remained on display. It was not enough for the punishment to end with death. The empire demanded that its echo carry forward. What was once living had become an object of instruction. The broken form was not allowed to collapse into the dignity of burial or the privacy of grief. Instead, it was held aloft, exposed, made to serve even after life had gone. The executioners stepped back, wiping their blades clean with slow, ritual motions. They did not look at the face of the condemned, nor at the crowd. Their task was done, but they understood that their work lived on in the body that remained bound before them. Each cut, each careful slice, had left its mark not only on the man, but on the message the empire intended to send. The remains were no longer his own. They belonged now to power, to law, to memory. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lingered with eyes fixed on the body, unable to turn away from the sight of skin and bone laid bare by so many wounds. Others averted their gaze, their minds heavy with images they could not erase. Children were pulled close by their parents, shielded from the worst of the vision, though the shapes of it would follow them all the same. The afterlife of a broken body did not begin in another world. It began here, in the minds of those who carried its memory home. As hours passed, the grey sky dimmed, and shadows stretched across the square. Still the body hung, swaying faintly with the touch of wind. To some, it appeared less human now, more like an effigy, a figure carved by suffering into something meant to instruct rather than to be pitied. Yet for others, the sight stirred unease. Beneath the brutality, they could still see the outline of a man, someone who had once spoken, walked, eaten, dreamed. Stripped of breath, stripped of dignity, he remained present in absence, haunting even as he hung. The empire used such remnants deliberately. The punishment was not meant to end with silence, but to continue speaking through what was left behind. Bodies were often left on display, a grim warning to any who might harbour thoughts of disobedience. Villagers passing by would glance at them with fear. Merchants would whisper about them at market stalls, and travellers would carry tales of them far beyond the city walls. In this way, the afterlife of the condemned was not a spiritual passage, but a social one. His broken form lived on as a lesson, retold in hushed voices long after the flesh itself had decayed. There were practical consequences too. In a culture where burial rites were sacred, to be denied proper rest was to suffer even beyond death. Ancestors were honoured through ritual, through offerings, through remembrance. To die without these was to wander, unanchored, in the unseen world. The condemned man, denied the rights of family, denied the sanctity of burial, was condemned twice, once in life through punishment, and again in death through abandonment. His bodies, suspended for display, became a symbol not only of physical pain, but of spiritual exile. Night settled upon the square, and still the figure remained. Lanterns were lit, their light casting long shadows across the platform. Guards were stationed to ensure that no one interfered. No grieving hand dared to cut the ropes or hide the evidence. The body, silent now, continued its work more powerfully than words could. Each passer-by who caught sight of it, whether by accident or by intention, felt the echo of the punishment in their own chest. It was as though pain radiated outward even after life had gone, refusing to fade with the last breath. The executioners had gone home, their knives cleaned, their duty complete. Yet in their dreams, perhaps, the image would return, the way the man's body had trembled, the way breath had finally slipped into silence. Though their faces showed no emotion, they too carried fragments of what they had witnessed, what they had caused. The afterlife of a broken body did not stop with the condemned. It seeped into every hand that had touched the blade, every eye that had watched. The officials, secure in their chambers, would record the event in ledgers, neat lines of brushstrokes capturing what had been done. To them, it became a case closed, justice fulfilled, order reinforced. But paper could not carry the weight of the square, the silence of the crowd, the heaviness of the man's still body beneath the dim sky. That weight lived elsewhere, in memory, in whispers, in the air that clung to the city like a faint scent of smoke that refused to clear. Days might pass before the body was removed, before what remained of flesh was lowered into the earth or discarded without ceremony. By then, the punishment would have already achieved its second purpose. The sight of it would linger in those who had walked by, whether they admitted it aloud or not. Children would recall it when night fell quiet. Merchants would trade stories about it along with their wares. Strangers would carry it into other towns, where it would grow into rumour, into legend. The body had been broken, but through its breaking, its presence was multiplied, scattered like seeds across the land. In time, even when the square was emptied and the ropes untied, even when only faint stains remained upon the platform, the memory would not leave. People would point to the place and speak softly, as though the air itself still held the sound of the man's last breath. They would remember how long it had lasted, how silence had stretched around it, how the final release into death had not ended the punishment, but only shifted it into another form. For the condemned, if his spirit lingered, there would be no rest. Without rites, without prayers, without the comfort of family offerings, he was left adrift. In the beliefs of the time, such a spirit could not join the ancestors, could not find peace. He remained bound, not by ropes, but by the unfinished nature of his death. And perhaps that was the Empire's final cruelty, that even beyond the grave, the punishment endured. The afterlife itself became part of the sentence. And so, the broken body hung not only in the square, but in the imagination of all who had seen it, in the whispers of those who spoke of it, in the restless stirrings of the dead denied their rest, The punishment had ended, but it had not ended. It lived on, shaping fear, shaping obedience, shaping the very way people thought of law and empire. The man was gone, but the afterlife of his broken body had only begun. The square grew silent after the body was gone. Where ropes once strained and flesh once bore the weight of justice, there remained only faint traces, a darkened stain upon wood, a memory of cries swallowed by air. Yet absence did not erase the presence of what had been witnessed. If anything, it deepened it. In emptiness, people's minds filled the void with recollection, with whispers, with the shadows of what they had seen. What vanished from sight grew sharper in thought. For the empire, this was enough. Death by 1,000 cuts was not designed to end in the body, nor in the crowd's gasp, nor even in the silence of a lifeless figure. It was designed to root itself deeper, to carve its mark into memory, into history, into the very way generations would understand power. And so it lived on, not in flesh, but in recollection, a lesson etched across time more enduring than stone. People carried fragments of it with them. A merchant returning from the capital might sit in a tea house miles away, lowering his voice as he described the sight to companions. His hands, trembling slightly, might mimic the slow strokes of the knife, the measured patience of the executioner. Listeners would lean closer, horrified yet compelled, unable to look away from words that painted the scene as vividly as any ink brush. The punishment travelled like this, carried by rumour, preserved in trembling voices, retold as warning. But memory does not remain pure. With each retelling, it grew sharper in some places, blurred in others. A child who overheard a hushed account would later recall the story with additions: more blood, more screams, more cruelty than had truly unfolded. By the time it reached distant provinces, it became both truth and legend, a punishment real in law, but expanded by imagination. History was not only written in documents, it was carved into the minds of those who bore its stories forward. In official records, the accounts were precise. Neatly brushed characters described the charges, the judgment, the punishment. They carried no tremor, no hesitation, no flicker of human unease. To read them was to enter a world of formality, where 1,000 cuts could be reduced to a line of ink, a sentence stating that justice was served. Yet the truth lay not in the brushstrokes, but in the silence between them, the silence filled by human eyes, human hearts, human memories of what had unfolded. Walls themselves seemed to hold it. In the corridors where officials walked, in the stone platforms where punishments were carried out, in the timber beams of watching towers, the memory of such sentences clung like dust. Though no words were carved into them, the spaces themselves seemed to absorb the weight of what they had borne. To pass through them was to feel a heaviness, as though history itself pressed upon the air. Generations later, when new punishments were delivered in those same squares, the shadows of older ones lingered, unseen but not unfelt. The condemned, though broken in body, became unbroken in memory. His name may not have survived, his face may have blurred with time, but the image of his punishment lived on as a symbol. He was no longer just a man accused of crimes. He became a vessel for fear, a lesson passed on to those who never met him. In this way, history stripped him of individuality and remade him into permanence. The afterlife of a broken body turned into the permanence of a broken memory, etched, reshaped, sharpened into something that belonged not to him, but to the empire. And yet memory has a strange duality. It serves power, reinforcing obedience, but it also preserves unease. For those who whispered of the punishment, there was often a tremor of doubt behind their words. Was such cruelty just? Was such pain necessary? Though spoken softly, and never in the hearing of officials, such questions lingered in the quiet spaces of thought. Memory carved fear into the walls of history, but it also carved uncertainty. It reminded people not only of the Empire's strength, but of its capacity for unrelenting cruelty. Generations passed, but the stories remained. In dusty villages, grandfathers told children tales of terrible punishments once carried out by imperial decree. They spoke of slow suffering, of bodies undone by countless wounds, of executioners whose hands never trembled. The children, wide-eyed and sleepless, carried those tales forward, repeating them in the same hushed tones decades later. The punishment became less an event of one time, and more an enduring symbol of what authority could demand. Even when dynasties fell, when emperors were replaced and laws rewritten, the memory lingered. The punishment was abolished eventually, but by then it had already done its work. It was impossible to erase. Stories outlast laws. Fear outlasts decrees. The 1,000 cuts remained alive in thought long after they were gone from practice. History does not release so easily what it has carved into itself. The walls of history held it in ways subtle and haunting. In faded paintings, in quiet records, in whispered warnings, the presence of the punishment endured. It lived in the ink of scholars, in the fears of peasants, in the uneasy silences of markets where someone mentioned the cruelty of the old empire. The condemned man's body had vanished into dust long ago, yet in this way he remained, not as himself, but as a shadow carried through time. What is remembered shapes the living. That is the true legacy of punishment such as this. They do not end with the body, or even with the crowd. They linger in thought, and thought shapes behaviour. People bent their actions, curbed their words, avoided paths that might lead them near rebellion, not simply because of the law, but because of what they remembered the law could do. In that sense, death by 1,000 cuts stretched endlessly forward, its blade still sharp in the imagination, centuries after its practice had ceased. The Empire may not have understood it fully, but what it created was more than justice. It created an inheritance of memory, one heavy, one terrifying, one that clung not only to those who lived in its shadow, but to those who studied it long after. Historians, turning the brittle pages of old records, could not help but pause when they reached the mention of Lingchi. They too felt the echo of it, the way silence seemed to lengthen after the words were read. Even centuries removed, the punishment continued to speak. And so the memory of death by 1,000 cuts became less about the body, less about the executioners, less even about the crowd, and more about what lingered in the air afterward. It was carved into stone, into silence, into whispers, into the uneasy way people looked at authority. It lived not in flesh, but in fear, not in time, but in eternity. The man had been broken. The crowd had dispersed. The empire had moved on. Yet history itself carried the lesson forward, unwilling to let it fade. The punishment lived as memory, carved deep into walls no hand could ever smooth away. And there, in the quiet space where past and present meet, it remains. And so we drift back from the shadowed courts and the quiet squares where a life was slowly undone. What we have wandered through tonight was not only punishment, but memory, the silence of power, the patience of ritual, the way fear itself can be stretched across generations. Perhaps what lingers most is not the suffering of the condemned, but the stillness that surrounded it, the hush of the crowd, the steady hands of the executioner, the weight of history pressing against the moment. It is strange how the body disappears, yet the memory remains, carved not into flesh, but into the imagination of those who carried it forward. I wonder, as you lie here listening, what stays with you from this journey? Was it the whisper in the dark courts where the sentence was first spoken? The gathering of onlookers beneath grey skies? Or the thought that even after death, the memory of such punishments continued to shape the living? Let me know in the comments what part of this quiet history stayed with you tonight. Each of your reflections becomes another light flickering in the long chain of memory, linking us across time, across distance. And if you found yourself carried gently through this story, consider subscribing to this channel. It helps these forgotten histories travel a little further, finding others who need a calm voice to guide them into sleep. For now, close your eyes. Let the weight of the world soften, and let history fade into the silence of night.